As long as there's enough supportable evidence, I don't really mind saying something that I know there's going to be a lot of negative comments about. That might seem weird, but what I'm trying to say is that when I talk about something like Chaos Max Dragon negatively, I'm very aware that I'm going to get a ton of angry commenters, and sometimes it's fun to laugh at them, but long after commenters don't understand Chaos Max Dragon, I'm still getting negative comment after negative comment on those older videos. But I don't mind that, because we have enough evidence to show that Chaos Max Dragon and cards that I've made similar videos about aren't very competitive. However, up until this point, for the last 2 years, there's been one card, one deck archetype that I pretty much refuse to talk about. That's Dark Magician, as the title would suggest, and in today's video I'm going to talk about why I don't really discuss this card, and also discuss, yes, I'm going to actually do it, I'm going to tell you why Dark Magician decks aren't very competitive. And I think the reason I'm finally doing this video is because I've always gotten requests to talk about Dark Magician more extensively than I have in the past. It's a very popular deck with ex-Yu-Gi-Oh players that only play casually, I should say ex-competitive Yu-Gi-Oh players, and even at competitive tournaments every once in a while you'll see a Dark Magician player at the lower tables just having the time of their life. And that's perfectly fine. I think that one of the main reasons that I don't really talk about Dark Magician is that in the past, when I have talked about Dark Magician, that was so long ago that my channel outlook was very different, and I was pretty harsh on people playing that deck, when in reality, anyone is welcome to play whichever decks that they want to play, as long as they don't misinform themselves and think that deck is more competitive than it actually is. The first time I mentioned Dark Magician officially was in a video titled Dark Magician Debunked, and to be fair, a lot of people didn't really understand the angle that I was trying to take when I wrote that script. And I mention that because, yeah, I don't really write scripts anymore, I just sort of go in a more conversational tone, and I felt that writing a script really took away from that. So nowadays, when I record something, I record everything in like 30-second to 1-minute snippets and then just do multiple takes until I get it to where I like it. And when I uploaded that video and started to see the initial reaction to it, one of the things that I quickly realized was that a lot of people missed the fact that it was a joke. It was a satirical video talking about the normal monster flavor text, something that I don't really talk about in any other videos, but a lot of people took it super seriously actually, and it was very surprising to me. But looking back on it, I realized that it's because I was reading off of a script. I was badly reading off of a script, and it didn't really have the conversational tone that most of my other videos aim to have. And don't feel bad if you haven't watched that video, it's perfectly fine. Basically what I did is that I talked about the flavor text of Dark Magician and mainly focused on the fact that it wasn't really the ultimate wizard in terms of attack and defense. It wasn't really either of those things, and a lot of people took it way more seriously than I ever imagined. And that context matters because the second time that I talked about the deck or the card was in a video that I definitely wouldn't make looking back on things, or at least that I would have titled differently, but at the time, and I guess right now, it still says top 5 Yu-Gi-Oh decks that you can't laugh at. Now, I didn't realize how people would read that title, and how people, even to this day, people are going back and commenting on that video, they don't really understand what the video is about, but a lot of people read that title and think, okay, I'm talking about underdog decks that are very powerful, or more powerful than people think they are. However, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about decks in that video where I feel you can't laugh at them because their fan base will come at you with pitchforks, and maybe if that video wasn't one of the biggest videos on my channel, I would change the title, but I'm not really comfortable with changing the title on a video that already has so many views from people that saw the original title. But if it was to be retitled, I'd probably name it something like Top 5 Toxic Yu-Gi-Oh Archetype Fan Bases. That'd probably clear a lot up for some of the commenters on that video. Basically, the Dark Magician portion of that video was specifically referencing that first video that I made, and I said that Dark Magician fans are so toxic because they can't even understand when I'm making a joke about their deck, not really analyzing it from a serious perspective. One of the other things that I said in that video that eventually, to be completely honest, I would learn is true for most casual or less represented archetypes out there is that many of the Dark Magician players that were angrily commenting on the previous video were ones that were saying the exact same thing. What they were all saying, which is kind of ironic because if everyone's saying it, it really doesn't mean it's true, but what they were all individually saying was that they could build the deck in a way that no one else could, and that's why the deck hasn't been competitive. Now, at the time that I made that video, which was 2 years ago, I didn't realize that basically every single less popular deck had the exact same players saying the exact same thing. However, at the time, I thought it was unique to Dark Magician specifically, so that was the first time that I mentioned that particular comment in a video. And over the past 2 years since that video was posted, I sort of realized where that comment stemmed from. It stems from players that don't go to tournaments or maybe don't do very well at tournaments saying things along the lines of, well, the tier 1 decks are just autopilot. They're all helmet strategies. These are decks out there that don't take any skill to build, any skill to play. My deck takes skill to build. My deck takes skill to play. I just get sacked at every tournament that I go to. And this is something that I see from a lot of less competitive players, but specifically with Dark Magician players, I notice it more than I notice it in other fan bases, which isn't to say that all Dark Magician players are like this, but there's certainly a vocal minority that I notice in my own comment section anytime that I bring up Dark Magician. Even if I'm just bringing it up neutrally, just to mention the card, I always get a ton of people that are flocking to the comment section just to say that their build is the best one out there and no one else has figured out how to run it. But here's the thing, that's not really that true. One of the biggest differences between how I see how casual players and competitive players review decks is that a competitive player will look at a deck with 5 cards different from the standard build and they'll say, wow, those 5 cards were really cool and they made a huge difference, and that's why that person topped and the other more standard version didn't top. Where a casual player will look at that and say, oh, it's only 5 cards different, he just net decked this from the last tournament. I think this comes into play when they build decks from the ground up and they're thinking, well, if I spend the most amount of time building my own deck without net decking, somehow I get brownie points when I go to a tournament. But for most players, that doesn't actually matter. It only really matters if you're successful with the deck, not so much if you didn't net deck any other player out there. I know this deck has a huge fan base. I don't want to say that all the cards in the deck are terrible, so I do want to highlight a couple cards that are at least halfway decent, even though they come with their own set of challenges. If you'd like to know, before I look at these cards, the biggest issue that I personally see with Dark Magicians from a competitive standpoint, it's that there aren't really 1-card combos, and there really aren't even 2-card combos. Almost all of the successful combos in a Dark Magician deck are either 3 or 4 cards, and a lot of times you're playing cards that if you don't draw them in the exact right combination, they don't really do anything. That's something that you really just can't have in a competitive deck. I know a lot of people make fun of Blue Eyes, and Blue Eyes certainly bricks a lot, but in terms of the sheer amount of starter cards that you find in a Blue Eyes deck compared to a Dark Magician deck, Dark Magician just can't keep up with that amount of consistency, which is ironic because Blue Eyes isn't a very consistent deck relative to the other decks of the game. In relation to the overall power level of the other cards in the Dark Magician deck, Apprentice Illusion Magician is one of, if not the best cards that you can see going first or second. Discarding a card to special summon it and then searching in Dark Magician is pretty cool, I guess, in the context of a Dark Magician strategy. Unfortunately, this card doesn't really grab anything that matters. I think one of the big differences between Blue Eyes and Dark Magician is that the Blue Eyes deck actually does take pretty good use and pretty good advantage of Blue Eyes White Dragon, where the Dark Magician deck, it always seems kind of awkward. You're not really getting a lot of value from that normal monster that you're playing, which means that you don't really have a lot of reasons to search it with cards like Apprentice Illusion Magician. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of cards, even cards that I'm about to talk about, that do interact with Dark Magician, but in terms of competitive validity, more Blue Eyes cards are successful that interact with the vanilla Blue Eyes monster than there are competitive cards that interact with Dark Magician. Dark Magical Circle is one of, if not the best card in the entire archetype, and yet it's still not quite good enough compared to other archetypes out there, even ones released at the same time as this card. It's cool and it can add Dark Magician not just a spell or trap card, which is kind of neat, but the problem with Dark Magical Circle, the problem with most of these cards, is that if you don't have other cards to combo with them, a lot of times they just sit there doing nothing. In the case of Dark Magical Circle, the main problem is that if you don't add a card to your hand with this effect, which by the way, if you get the add, it's a really solid card, but if you don't get the add, if it completely whiffs, then it's just a do nothing card that sits on the board until you have 2 other cards to special summon a guy and then trigger its effect to banish something. If this card gets going, and if your opponent has no interruptions, this card is pretty darn good. However, in most cases, because the Dark Magician deck isn't very threatening, doesn't really put up a lot of negations, a lot of times the things that trigger Dark Magical Circle just end up getting negated, and this card just sits on the board doing nothing. And yes, I'm completely aware that Magician of Dark Illusion exists, and it's a pretty decent way to trigger Dark Magical Circle. The problem is that if you don't have Dark Magical Circle, this card basically doesn't do anything, especially if you also don't have a Dark Magician in your graveyard. Yes, it's a free special summon, but does that really matter if it's not also banishing a card? If I could redesign these cards, maybe this card would be the thing that banishes. Maybe just banishes whenever it's special summoned. That would be kind of cool, and it means that you wouldn't always have to have exactly this card and Dark Magical Circle to actually make an impact on your opponent's field. And that brings us to the card that perfectly describes the issues with Dark Magicians. Eternal Soul is a really good trap card if you ignore one line of its text. The main issue with this card is that if this face-up card leaves the field, destroy all monsters you control. Why is this on Eternal Soul? I don't know. Maybe Konami thought it'd be too overpowered if it didn't do that, but the fact of the matter is that I don't even know if this card unnerfed, like if it didn't have that destruction effect, I don't know if that would be enough to make Dark Magicians viable, but definitely with that effect on here, there's no chance of the deck being successful because this card is so important to have up. Protecting your Dark Magician monsters from being affected by your opponent's card effects is insane. It is a very powerful addition to your normal Dark Magician plays, and also getting a free Monster Reborn or a card from your hand every single turn is a really good effect, and even the effect to add Dark Magic attack is kind of relevant against slower strategies. The problem is that because this card is so important, because you want to have it on the field, if your opponent just summons a Nightmare Phoenix or Mystical Space Typhoons you or Twin Twizzers you lose all of your monsters, and Dark Magicians don't really have a good way of recovering those. I am very aware that there are ways to protect this card, but for consistency reasons we can't add too many cards to our combos because already you're looking at situations where you need to draw 3 specific cards to do any real plays. Anyway though, I think I'm sick of talking about Dark Magician. This is the most I've ever talked about this deck in a video, and it'll probably be the only time that I ever bring up Dark Magician for the foreseeable future. I'm sure that even though most of this video is talking about the issues when I make these videos, not even really talking about Dark Magician at all, I'll still get a ton of angry comments, even people that aren't being like trolls or whatever, people that legitimately feel that Dark Magician is a very solid competitive choice, and that definitely just really turns me off to making these types of videos. I'm fine talking about almost any other archetype in the game, but Dark Magician specifically, I don't know what it is. Maybe they're just like sad or mad that Blue Eyes like won a world championship and Dark Magician basically hasn't ever done anything. I think it maybe has a regional top and it almost topped a YCS like one time when the cards first came out, but overall the deck is just so not competitive. Maybe people are a little bit angry that it's not as good as Blue Eyes. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.